I think Kashmir's importance was rightly exemplified when none less than Adi Shankaracharya, after establishing the four pithas in the cardinal points of India, he established a Sarvagnya Peeth in Kashmir. Sarvagnya, or the all knowing. So, Kashmir that way becomes the epicenter of our civilization as the center of knowledge, where goddess Sharda was the presiding deity. The script that they had was also the Sharda script. And that is why I think it's been under attack since then till now. And I thought, what better way to start a book on civilizational glory than the place that was the epicenter of our civilization, which is Kashmir, and with a person who exemplified that in all ways. One of the greatest monarchs from that part of the country, who sadly we know so little of, Lalita Aditya Mukta.
Very good evening. Welcome back to Swarajya Conversations. This is your host Sharan Setty. I'm really privileged to be joined by Dr. Vikram Sampath, who needs absolutely no introduction. I've received a copy of Bravehearts of Bharat, Vignettes from Indian History, which is a really amazing compilation of unsung heroes of the Indian freedom struggle, ranging from the 7th century AD and to almost the 19th century. Dr. Sampath, thank you so much for joining us. A very good evening to you.
Yeah, good evening, Sharan. Thank you for inviting me to your show.
First of all, I think this is quite a break from your traditional recent writings, say with the biographies of Savarkar ji, because it's a much more long form, it's focused biographical work. So, does this come as a break? And I also wanted to ask you, since in the past you've spoken and written about unsung heroes of Indian history. For instance, you've spoken about how Tippu Sultan is glorified over the Wadayars in Indian history books. So, is this a continuation of that pursuit you had perhaps started a few years ago?
Yes, Sharan, actually, I mean, all my books, right from the first one, which was Splendors of Royal Mysore, the untold story of the Wadiyars. Again, when one talks of Mysore, it's only Tipu Sultan who comes to everyone's mind. But here were the Wadiyars who ruled for 600 long years, one of the longest reigning royal houses, like the Ahoms in Assam. But then in the national imagination, I think the Wadiyars don't carry much factor of recounting about who they are, despite southern Karnataka or the Mysore state. The numerous firsts to its credit and the foundations of economic prosperity, cultural osmosis, all of that that was laid during the Wadiyar rule, that has been sadly forgotten. So that too was a forgotten history. The two other biographies that I wrote on forgotten musicians too, that also came under this larger rubric. Gauhar Jaan, who was the first Indian and the first woman of the subcontinent to record her voice on the gramophone. Again, nobody in Hindustani music knew who she was. And likewise, from Carnatic music, you had this wonderful maverick musician, Dr. S. Balachandar, the Veena Vidwan, who learned the veena by himself. He created his own bani or style of playing the veena. He was a self-taught Tamil filmmaker, chess player, all of that. But then he too, for various reasons, was completely he'd become a pariah in Carnatic music. And then, of course, Veer Savarkar and the two volumes on him. So I think somewhere all these characters of the past who have not received their due, they probably come looking for redemption from my pen. And I feel so fortunate and blessed to be chosen as the medium to give vent to their stories and voices to the larger public. And this book, that way, I was thinking of probably 18 or 20 people, but restricted it to about 15 to make it a little less bulky, unlike most of my books, which many people say you can also double them up as dumbbells. But so I thought this could be a break even from the size of the book, to make it a little more sleek, and you can carry it along with you on a flight or whatever and read about fascinating
Right.
lives. But biographies really are, I think, a window to history, and that's how I look at history, through the lives of interesting people of that particular era.
Is there a particular methodology you followed to sort of narrow down to the names that you've written about?
Yeah, it was a very tough choice to actually put together these 15 as to who should be there. It was more about who to leave out, because there were just so many names. And so, one criteria that I had was it should cover a wide time span, like you rightly mentioned, from the 7th century till the 19th century. I thought there should be a cutoff also at 1857, because what comes after that is the larger, freedom movement, what we would categorize as. So 1857 as the cutoff period. And the first invasions, particularly from the Middle East, started in the 7th century. So that could be the starting point. The other criteria was, can vast parts of the country be represented, particularly those which have been traditionally ignored in Indian historiography? South of India, the Northeast. I wanted to include a lot more from the Northeast, but finally managed to zero in only with two people. And another important criteria was that there should be equal importance given to women as well. While there are 8 men, there are 7 women whom I try to fit into this collection. Very difficult to find, sources, information about several of these people. Lot of it rests only in regional literature, oral narratives, folklore, and all of that, but very little published material, unfortunately, on such great as well as interesting lives.
No, most certainly. I mean, even in Karnataka, if you have to learn about the history of, say, people like Onake Obawa, we
Yeah.
only got an idea about it because Chitradurga is very nearby and a song was actually made about it.
Yes. Film.
And
Yeah.
today you're actually writing about it, which is a great thing. Since you also mentioned that you've given equal importance to the women rulers in Indian history, it makes it very interesting because when you write about the likes of Rani Naiki Devi of Gujarat or even Rani Abbaka Chowta of Ullal, essentially what distinction do you see from their male counterparts in terms of their administrative outlook?
Not only, I mean, even Rani Abbaka, for instance, and this was the Delaval, who was the Italian traveler who came all the way looking, because her fame had spread even to the Middle East, and in the Persian court, somebody was talking about her. And especially when she managed to get the Portuguese armada completely destroyed through a night attack by, you put these ammunition in coconut chips and then throw it across the seas, and all the Portuguese fleet
Right,
had caught fire, and that created a lot of stir even outside India. And so this Italian person comes as a traveler among many parts of India that he visits. He also goes to Ullal and meets her, and then he reproduced his first person account of how he saw Abbaka, what he thought of her. He didn't think of her as being exceptionally beautiful, though. He thought she was very dark and very unlike the queen imagination that he had. But
right,
she had a lot of maternal care for even a foreign traveler who had come there. She asked him, "Why
right,
have you been going all over the world? Are you heartbroken or something, which is why you want to go all over and find some solace?" He said, "No, no, no, I'm fine that way. But if you come to such a distant land, who will take care of you in case you fall ill or you have a high fever?" And he said, "No, Jesus Christ is my God and he will take care of me." So he writes there that here was a queen who had so many things to involve herself in, but she was showing so much of maternal concern for someone she met for the very first time. So I think the women, whether it was
right.
Abbaka or much later Ahilya Bai Holkar, the woman as the ruler also made them very, very maternal in the way they looked at their kingdom, their subjects. I think that was a common feature I saw among many of them. They took care of their subjects as though they were their own children. Probably the men folk were not that kind of connected to their subjects as much as the women were. So these were
Right.
just some illustrations of, the loving care with which they actually treated everybody, including, a stranger whom they just met.
In that sense, the representation of historically matrilineal societies in our history is
Yeah.
very restricted. Would you agree? Because for those who've studied history or sociology and matters like that, I think they kind of have an idea about it. But for the rest of them, I don't think they're. It's somewhat alien, so to
True,
speak.
true. And that's largely in the coastal area. The Travancore also. I mean, the manner in which the matrilineal system there. You had it even in Gadwal, the Stri Rajya that was there in Gadwal, or the coastal Karnataka, Ullal, and this entire region, places there. So we know so little about those systems and how important the role of the woman was in this. So, I mean, if you'd ask me, like, whom would I have chosen? I had so many. The Mahadevis of Odisha, of the Bhaumakara dynasty. We probably have never heard of several of them. We also had Rani Didda of Kashmir, Durgavati from the Madhya Pradesh region, whom there's so little known other than the fact that she led a very valiant attack against Akbar. And then, of course, the Rani Karnavati from Gadwal, the Rani Mangamal from Madurai, Kitturani Chennamma, and all. We certainly know some amount of the information, but Chennamma of Keladi, Maratha Queen Tarabai, whom I kind of mention here, the Begums of Bhopal, all these people, and in fact even Begum Hazrat Mahal. There's so little. While Rani Lakshmi Bai is the primordial symbol of 1857, Begum Hazrat Mahal too, in her own way, led a very, very great attack on the British in 1857. And Lucknow was one of the last fortresses to be breached by the
Right.
British during the uprising. But we don't really have too much information about her background, and all of that. So I think history and historiography has been extremely unfair to the women, despite all their great achievements that they've done.
Is that perhaps because the historiography in India has been focused on societies that are rather, quote unquote, patriarchal or male dominant in the past?
Yeah, yeah, true. That is true. Because, even Nike Devi, I was actually so irritated to look at even her contemporary records by Indians, the Jain scholars or the Sanskrit scholars, Meru Tunga, and all these people who had written. First of all, she had a little kid who's an infant king whose regent she was, and tying him to her waist, she burst out into the battlefield in 1178 and defeated Muhammad Ghori in the Battle of Kasarhada. And despite that, her contemporary records, including the Chalukyan inscriptions from Gujarat, they talk about Muldeva, who was her infant son defeating somebody. This king was a child. It was his mother who did all of this. Only Meru Tunga at least mentions, her name, and that is also so disparaging. He says the Hamira or Muslim king, he was so weak that even a woman could actually vanquish him. So not giving credit to the lady for her strategy, her strength or whatever, but saying the opponent was so weak, otherwise he might have won, but since the opponent was so weak, even a woman could very easily defeat him. So how disparaging it is about
Right.
somebody who played a very pivotal role in our history. And barring that little detail here and there, Nike Devi is a totally forgotten character. All other details about her are largely fictional. There are several novels in Gujarati written about her, but
Yeah.
actual, documented facts, even from the Chalukyan inscriptions and records, bleak her out completely, which is extremely sad the way our historiography has been.
No, that's extremely fascinating what you just told me. And I think for the layman who may not understand the process of writing a volume like this, because you've written and spoken about people who are perhaps closer to the region where we live in that sense, whether it's the Vodayas or even, Veer Savarkar is also not very far away from where we are. So there is a sense of familiarity with their lives, with their language and traditions, so on and so forth. But now you've covered the whole subcontinent, and today you have translators and other sources which are much more easier, so citations are much more easier compared to before. But when
Yeah.
it comes to the oral tradition of passing on history in India, how do you sort of transcribe that into your book? Like, what's the process of it?
That's a great question because, yeah, oral traditions, for instance, this whole Bhuta Aradhane, which is so much in the news these days after the Kantara film. On my visit there, I actually witnessed one of these performances where the person whom they were invoking and actually extolling was Rani Abbaka. And, and a few members of the lineage of Abbaka, they told me about this detail, and she's commemorated that way in oral folklore, but a lot of it is fantastic, a lot of it is exaggerated, and so one needs to weigh on what of that you need to take on, and how much of it you can't take it in completeness, because a lot of it is highly exaggerated. Not
Right.
only oral, Sharan, because I mean even the written texts, for instance,
Yeah.
Kalhana, when he writes the Rajatarangini, he wrote it in the 13th century, but then he covers the entire history of Kashmir. And so, in that, the exaggeration, particularly of Lalitaditya as a world conqueror, he's somebody whom Kalhana claims had conquered almost the whole of India till Pragjotishpura, which was Assam, and going down even to Karnataka. He claims that. Lalitaditya defeated the Rashtrakuta king, then also crossed over to the Tamil land, and then crossed the seas and went to Sri Lanka. So, it's very almost the whole of India as we know today was under Kashmiri rule, which
Right.
doesn't seem plausible at all, because then you need to triangulate that with other extant evidence. Do the inscriptions in this part of the country, or do manuscripts here talk about a Kashmiri influence? Are there some coins or weapons or something that's been found through some archaeological findings? So you need to cross verify and not take all of it, whether even if it is written text or it is these oral narratives, take it completely on its face value, but you need to triangulate that with multiple sources to come to some coherence of truthfulness in your narrative.
Since you also spoke about Kashmir and your first chapter is about Lalitaditya Muktapida and India, I mean, the Kashmir Valley is now at crossroads of history. It's at a very important juncture. We've seen the history evolve through the last 7 decades, and everybody's curious as to what will happen in the future. Not just in terms of the security situation, but even as a society, how it will progress. Was there a particular reason you chose to speak right about this in the first chapter of the book?
Yeah. Kashmir, at least in the Indic imagination, I think it was the epicenter. And that is why it has been under attack from time immemorial and continues to be. And thanks to the Karkotas and dynasties before, after, till of course the Shahamiri dynasty and Sikandar Butshikan and barbarians like that took over, we had an unbroken Hindu past of Kashmir. And it was not just a Hindu kingdom, but also a center of the greatest learning, philosophy, literature, astronomy, astrology, medicine, and Ayurveda, some magnificent palaces, buildings, temples, the Martand Sun Temple, and also interestingly, Buddhist shrines. There was this tolerance to other panthas or faiths within the Sanatan Dharma, unlike the false equivalence that is always created of Hindu Buddhist conflicts. Here was
Right.
a Hindu king who was, a very devout Vaishnava, who also built replicas of the Bamyan Buddhas and gigantic stupas in honor of Buddha in Kashmir. And Tibetan Buddhism too was influenced by, Kashmir Shaivism. There were deities like Avalokiteshvara and all of these people who were drawn from the Shaivite traditions. So I think Kashmir's importance was rightly exemplified when none less than Adi Shankaracharya, after establishing the four pithas in the cardinal points of India, he established a Sarvagnya Peeth in Kashmir. Sarvagnya, or the all knowing. So, Kashmir that way becomes the epicenter of our civilization as the center of knowledge, where goddess Sharada was the presiding deity. The script that they had was also the Sharada script. And that is why I think it's been under attack since then till now. And I thought, what better way to start a book on civilizational glory than the place that was the epicenter of our civilization, which was Kashmir, and with a person who exemplified that in all ways. One of the greatest monarchs from that part of the country,
Right.
who sadly we know so little of, Lalita Aditya Muktapida.
So sometimes it betrays the common sense of the common man when court historians come out and say that certain invasions in our Indian history, which is sort of glorified and normalized even to a large extent, say that this was all done for economic gains. But at the end of the Mughals actually stayed back in India, they didn't go anywhere else. So, you can count it as a part of our treasury. So it was not just for economic reasons, was it?
Well, it was never the case. I mean, I've recounted it in the book too, where within a couple of decades after the death of Prophet Muhammad, it was a theology which spurred the tribe, the community, to go on a world conquest and to expand that. And one of the main driving features was to subdue the infidels. And so, within a couple of decades after his passing away, almost the whole of Central, Asia, Northern Africa, and places like Egypt, Syria, Palestine, all of these, and the Sassanid Empire, all these empires too collapsed to the might of the Arab sword. And so they had a vast kingdom in about 80 years after his passing away, which expanded almost touching the shores of the Atlantic on the west and the gates of India on the east. So, where was, if it was only economic which was important. Economic reasons were important, but there was a very, very strong religious and theological drive too, which kept them coming all the way. And much later, even when Timur comes and attacks Delhi, he did not want to conquer Delhi. He did not want to colonize India or anything. And but the his main grouse was the Delhi Sultans were not doing enough for the sake of Islam, and so he to
Right.
teach them a lesson, he comes all the way, and on one day he puts about 1 lakh people to death in Delhi. So religious driver was so important, and this is something that's exemplified in the court historians' accounts themselves. I mention this often about how when Mahmud of Ghazni came to the Somnath temple, when the priest there offered him money to, take, if you want money, that is all that you need. You take this money and go away and save our deity. He very clearly tells that, and this is recounted by historians of the times, whether it's Farishta or Al Baruni or whoever else, that Minhaji Siraj, that if I do this, that I accept money and go away, I will be called a trader of idols. Whereas I want to be known, my legacy should be known as someone who's a destroyer of idols. I want to be known as Butch Shikan. So this was a very, I mean, how many idols, how many temples you broke was actually recounted by their court chroniclers with pride, that this was done to exalt the true faith. So when that was the contemporary records, today ex post facto we are looking at that and giving this justification that all this was done only for monetary reasons. Now, even about the Mughals, I know that this argument is made very often, that they stayed back here, etc. But Angus Madison, in his account, he talks about how, while the percentage share of India's GDP in global economy might have increased then, the per capita GDP of Indians was a steady decline at the even the heights of the Mughal Empire. So of course they amassed wealth, they kept it to themselves, but it didn't do anything for India or for Indians. The amount of money that went to each Indian was actually on a steady decline, and so I don't understand how it makes any difference to the country or its people that they actually stayed here and so on. Projects that they undertook were all for their own lavish spending and luxury, and hardly anything for public welfare or interest.
No, the more we read history, the more we realize that we don't know anything about it. That's one fascinating thing about history. So, since both of us are from the South, and I've always felt this, if you look at the freedom struggle, especially in the 19th century and the 18th, you realize that the South was much more fortunate because the North had very ugly desecration of temples and loot and all of that. So, in that sense, do you think the South is far less sympathetic to the North when it comes to matters like this? And I realized this only when I visited places of historical and religious importance, like the Somnath Mandir, which you were mentioning about, right? And when you read more about, say, rulers like Ahilya Bai Holkar, you just understand how much we've been ignorant to our own people.
Yeah, no, that's a great observation, because, yeah, you're right. We think, everything up north, there's been such a dilution, even of, rituals, the way the temples and religious structures are. And there is a historical reason for that. But what we don't give credit for is, you're right, that we in the south of India have been fortunate to have the Vindhyas as one major bulwark, other than a few incursions of, say, the Khiljis and Malik Kafur and all of them. We didn't have so many invasions from up north. Whereas the north, the western part of India has unfortunately borne the brunt of this all the time. But it's not as if they capitulated too. They put on such a huge resistance and fight, because mind you, when the Arab invasion too, we talk of 710, 712, when Muhammad bin Qasim comes to Sindh and takes over Debal, and then Raja Dahar is killed there. But almost 50, 60 years before that, from then on, the Arabs had kept trying to occupy Sindh, but they could not do that, and they were beaten and thrown out every time. And finally, it was only Muhammad bin Qasim who got victory. But even that, he could not extend beyond those very small confines of Sindh. He tried his level best to go up north to Kashmir. Lalitaditya pushed him away. Then, towards the mainland, towards the Indo-Gangetic plains, Yashovarman and Lalitaditya, who were rivals, they joined hands and again pushed him back. And then in central and even the Deccan region, when he tried to enter there, you had this large confederacy of Bappa Raval and Pulakeshin and Nagabhatta. and Vikramaditya, the Chalukya king, and also his feudatory Danti Durga, who was the Rashtrakuta, later became the Rashtrakuta king. All of them
Right.
join hands and they push him back. So the North has put in several, and it took the Islamic Sultanate to establish 500 years since their first entry into the Indian shores. So the North has put in so much of resistance. And at some point, of course, they capitulated because of the constant incursions that kept happening. But
Yeah.
the result of that is, a fractured culture, fractured religious structures there, and all of that, which is a very sad part. So rather than look at it disparagingly, there needs to be, as you rightly put, a sense of sympathy for what they have undergone, and despite all of that, they have kept the faith and traditions and the light alive despite all these troubles.
Yeah. One of the things that people usually take pride in as a community and as a civilization and as a country, or whatever terms we would like to use about it, is that we were never invasive as a society. We would never go outside and try to desecrate other institutions and try to rape and plunder the people and the treasury over there. But there is challenge to that hypothesis as well in recent times, especially when you talk about the Cholas and their history with Southeast Asia. People say
Yeah.
that if India had never been expansionist in nature, then why were the Cholas in Southeast Asia? But obviously, it's a little bit different, right?
Yeah, it was not an expansion, Charan, because there's a chapter in the book on Rajaraja Chola and Rajendra Chola. And here, in detail, I lay out that during the Chola time, when the Cholas were at the height of their power, the Fatimids in Egypt and the Song dynasty in China, they were the main, players of the South, the Pacific Ocean, the Indian Ocean region of trade. And so, Southeastern Asia, the Sri Vijaya, and the whole Malay Peninsula, which was a very important trade post, it was commercial reasons and lot of competition between all these powers, whether it was the Cholas, the Chinese, and the Egyptians, all of them vying for a pie in the Sri Vijayan economy, and that entire Southeast Asia. And Sri Vijaya was trying to play sides, sometimes supporting China, which was of course the big brother. And so it was one-upmanship on basically trade concerns, commercial concerns, and to teach Sri Vijaya a lesson was why Rajendra Chola in 1025 he launched this attack, where 14 important ports of Sri Vijaya were attacked, and but he did not colonize it. It was a one-time attack, and then he came back, and afterwards Sri Vijaya continued, but he got special trade concessions. So a lot of Tamil merchants, Tamil groups and guilds and so on could now go to Southeast Asia. So because of this flow of population, particularly from the Tamil land all the way to Southeast Asia, the Tamil culture and Indian culture managed to go there. But we never colonized it. We were not expansionist in that way, of wanting to put a Chola colony there or whatever. They probably just built
Right.
one temple or something. Same with Sri Lanka. So Sri Lanka to Anuradhapura, which was the capital, that was
Yeah.
completely destroyed by first Rajaraja Chola, and then he established his in his trademark. He would always go and build one gigantic Shiva temple with a long, tall gopura, like the Brihadishwara, miniature versions of that in different parts. So he did
Right.
that even in Sri Lanka. But then he put a feudatory or somebody from the existing clan, and slowly there would be revolts, rebellions, and the king who was there earlier would come back after a coup or a sabotage. So same with Maldives, which he conquered, Rajaraja. So whether it was Maldives or Sri Lanka or Southeast Asia, the entire Malay Peninsula, it was largely only for trade considerations, and we never colonized anyone. It's only through the transfer of population and the exchanges that happened that
Yeah.
culture, religion, dance forms, art forms, painting, fabrics, all this, there was a lot of interaction, and that's how that continues even now. In Southeast Asia, you have such a strong Indian influence and Hindu influence that we see there.
Even a Tamil influence for that matter, I think in countries like
True.
Singapore, it's very
Yeah.
strong, and in a way they don't disregard. that Indian influence. I think they take it with a lot of pride, and we can see that, and it's helping them with tourism as well. When it
Yeah,
comes to the Northeast, it's really interesting because it is challenging, I'm sure, even to a historian who's so
yeah.
accomplished like you, to sort of read the history of the Northeast, even though some of the works may be in English now. Why do you think it's taken so long for us to tell the story of the Northeast? And even today, in spite of the BJP being there, a lot of people do not get that recognition apart from a few leaders who may be very vocal in the media in that sense. So, as a result of this proselytization that perhaps happened as an advent of the British Empire, today that conflicting identities are still at conflict with each other. So, what's the way forward going from there?
I think throwing light on the story of the Northeast. I think that should become a major national project. That we need to, if we actually need to emotionally integrate that portion of the country, which of course in the last I think 8 years, a lot of steps have been taken for the economic integration and
Right.
giving the place the importance that it always deserved but never got. So to that extent, great work done, but a lot of cultural integration and the fact that, as you said, bringing the history and the stories of that part of the country into common and popular parlance. I think that is very extremely important. There is a lot of documentation that exists. For instance, in Assam, very meticulously you have these accounts called the Burunjis, which have been maintained, and Ahoms like the Wadiyars, they also ruled for 600 years. So from the 13th century onwards, everything that they underwent, their skirmishes, particularly with the Burma, the manner in which it was all the time on a collision path with the states of the Northeast, whether it was Manipur or Assam. So all these things have been documented there. Similarly, the Manipur records too of the Metis rulers there, all that is available. But there needs to be somebody who is mainstream historian of India, or the history of India needs to pull these out, translate it, get it into popular parlance, and not make it as some exoticized story which we don't even know of, or touch and think of. Only
Right.
when that happens, and when we say history of India, I think it should be representative of all parts of India, and the Northeast and its people are a very, very important and integral part of this.
What's next in line for you, Dr. Sampath?
Well, several projects. One is, of course, something I'm already working on, is a very difficult project, the biography of Tipu Sultan,
That'll be
which
very interesting.
yeah, like you mentioned, that will be the original form of a full length biography in detail,
Yeah.
and hopefully of a dumbbell size. But yeah, and to put all the myths and all the pro and cons of his rule and legacy, a very stormy rule, into perspective, and to bring all perspectives there, whether it was the Islamic records, the French, the British, the Kannada, all of that into some kind of coherence. It's going to be a very difficult project, and I hope to do it to the best of my ability.
I'm sure we look forward to reading that. I'm sure that is going to create a lot of stir, and basically, it will be retelling history in a right way for not just the state but a country which is very curious about a person who've only heard snippets here and there from people like you. Thank you so much for giving us your time today. It was a fascinating conversation.
Thank you, Sharan. Great pleasure talking to you. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you so much for joining us. And viewers, please do let us know what you thought about this conversation. And if you have any questions for Dr. Vikram Sampath, we'd be happy to ask him later on. In the meanwhile, please do order this book. It's called Bravehearts of Bharat, Vignettes from Indian History. It's available on Amazon and other platforms as well. Until next time, I'll see you around. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Bharat Varta podcast. If you want to see more content like this, then don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We started Bharat Varta to facilitate long form discussions on politics, policy, and culture. We don't necessarily endorse anything that was said in this episode. If you wish to offer us feedback, do reach out to us on social media. We are at Bharat Varta on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You could also get in touch with us on our website www.bharatvarta.in. The links are in the description below. Until next time, stay safe, take care, and Jai Hind.